Why, hello there. Today I want to talk to you about my thoughts on this UGreen HDMI switcher. It's a 2-in-1 out, so you can plug up something with an HDMI port as well as a USB-C port and plug it up to something like your TV. So I want to dive into this and talk about some features of it and see if it's worth picking up or not for you. So let's go ahead and dive in. And by the way, I did receive this from UGreen as a gift, so I don't have to return it or anything. Anyways, let's go ahead and dive into it. So basically, this little switcher right here allows you to connect two different devices at once into one single HDMI port. So say on your TV only has one or two HDMI ports, which a lot of them do nowadays. Not too sure why. It's kind of irritating, and I definitely have that with most of my TVs now. They only have two ports at most. So anyways, if you have one that only has a couple ports, this could be very useful because it offers you an HDMI port as well as a USB-C port. And so you can plug both in and you can switch between the two with this little button right in the middle, and just kind of attach it to the wall or attach it to the back of the TV. Makes it super easy to use. And actually, despite its small form factor, it does support 4K at 60 Hz with HDR, so that's pretty cool. And also supports Dolby Vision with HDCP 2.2. It's basically an anti-piracy protocol, so it's used for all like HDMI connections nowadays to help with unauthorized copying of like 4K and HDR content. It's not actually as much for us as it is for the companies and wanting to keep proprietary content to themselves, but it does feature that, so just FYI. And when I did test this, the 4K actually looks really nice. I tested it on my Switch as well as my MacBook and like a Fire Stick, and I thought it looked really nice. And my TVs are 4K and they support that, so for the visuals, I think they look great, and especially for the lower price on this. With the 18 gigabyte a second bandwidth as well as an aluminum housing, this thing does look pretty sleek, small and compact, and I mean, it looks decent. I don't know, for what it is. It looks modern. However, the aluminum cover on it does allow for a quick signal transmission as well as staying cool and resisting just kind of overall scratches and wear and tear. I don't think you're going to care about that too much, but just FYI, it does that. And the last thing that's cool about this is a plug and play, so you pretty much just plug this in and it works with most systems. So if you're like on a PC, if you're on Mac, if you're using some game system, whatever you're using, this is probably going to work. Despite all the good things that this has, there is a downside, and that is that it requires a USB-C plug to be powered on. For such a small device, I would have loved to not have to have a separate cord just for power, but I imagine that has to do with the 4K and all the features that it has with HDR support and Dolby Vision, all that stuff. So I take it it's probably the reason why it requires a power plug, but just FYI, it does require an extra cable. So you will have 4 cables sticking out of this thing. But it does work really nicely and small and compact, and honestly, you can just fit it behind your TV, especially if you have a plug behind the TV as well, or a power strip. You can just kind of plug that in there and you won't see any cords hanging down. But anyways, these are my thoughts on this. I hope this information helped you out in picking out a good little HDMI switcher for yourself. I think it worked really nicely, had no issues in lagging and any kind of stuttering. The 4K looked beautiful, and the overall quality of this seems to be very nice. So yeah, anyways, until next time, hope you have a great one. Bye. And if you like my content, feel free to give me a like or subscribe. It does help out the channel. So yeah, I just feel like I should plug that nowadays because I want to get to 100 subscribers. 1,000 maybe. I don't know. I'm not making money on here. Just FYI. At all.